The most dangerous mistake prejudice can make is assuming it already knows someone's story. The departure hall at Hartsfield Jackson Atlanta International Airport pulsed with the familiar rhythm of movement. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Flight announcements echoed overhead in calm, practiced voices. Children laughed as they chased one another between waiting families, while business travelers hurried toward security with coffee cups in one hand and boarding passes in the other. It looked like thousands of ordinary mornings that had come before, until every eye slowly turned toward Gate B-17. Daniel Brooks adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on as he stepped away from a coffee stand. Dressed in dark jeans, a navy jacket, and polished brown shoes, he blended effortlessly into the crowd. Nothing about him demanded attention. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't acting nervous. He simply checked the departure board, glanced at his watch, and continued walking toward his gate. He never made it another 20 feet. "Sir." The sharp voice cut cleanly through the surrounding noise. Daniel stopped. He turned slowly, his expression calm, finding two airport police officers approaching with deliberate confidence. Officer Ryan Carter walked slightly ahead of his partner, Officer Mason Walker. Their uniforms were immaculate, radios clipped neatly to their shoulders, every movement carrying the unmistakable confidence of men accustomed to immediate compliance. Ryan studied Daniel for only a second before speaking again. "We need to see your identification." Several nearby travelers slowed without meaning to. Daniel blinked once. "My identification? That's what I said." The officer's tone wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Authority often borrowed volume from the badge itself. Daniel offered a polite nod. "May I ask why?" Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because I'm asking." The answer hung in the air. No explanation. No accusation. Only expectation. Daniel looked briefly around the terminal before returning his attention to the officers. "I'd be happy to cooperate. I'd just like to understand what prompted the stop." Officer Mason Walker folded his arms. "You fit the description." Daniel remained still. "Could you tell me what that description is?" Neither officer answered immediately. Instead, Ryan allowed his gaze to travel slowly over Daniel's clothes, his carry-on bag, and finally back to his face. It wasn't a search. It felt more like a judgment already completed. A woman standing nearby quietly lowered the novel she had been reading. An elderly couple paused beside an airport information kiosk. Across the terminal, someone subtly raised a phone. Daniel noticed. So did Ryan. "No recording," Ryan warned. The young man holding the phone hesitated but didn't lower it completely. Daniel never took his eyes off the officers. "I don't intend to make this difficult." Ryan took another step forward. "Good. Then hand me your driver's license." Daniel reached slowly toward the inside pocket of his jacket before stopping halfway. "I'll retrieve it. But before I do..." He paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable. "Am I being detained?" The question seemed to irritate Ryan more than any refusal could have. "I'll ask the questions." Another announcement echoed overhead, calling passengers to begin boarding a flight bound for Chicago. Nobody nearby moved. It was as though the terminal itself had become reluctant to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Daniel lowered his hand from his jacket. His breathing remained steady. His posture never changed. There was no fear in his eyes, only careful observation. He noticed Ryan's clipped impatience. He noticed Mason subtly positioning himself to block one side of the walkway. He noticed the growing circle of curious strangers pretending not to watch. And then he noticed something else. Far across the terminal, beyond the security checkpoint entrance, a man in an ordinary gray suit briefly looked up from his phone. Their eyes met for less than a second. The man gave no signal, no smile, no expression at all. Then he returned to reading whatever was on his screen, disappearing once more into the anonymous flow of travelers. Daniel looked back at Officer Ryan Carter. "All right," he said quietly. "You have my attention." Ryan mistook those words for surrender. The passengers mistook them for compliance. But somewhere inside the airport, a sequence that had been waiting patiently for the right moment had just begun. Daniel Brooks never reached for his wallet again. Instead, he stood exactly where he was, his carry-on resting beside his polished shoes as the silence between him and Officer Ryan Carter stretched just a little too long. Around them, travelers pretended to focus on departure screens, but curiosity had already taken hold. The airport's constant rhythm continued, Yet a small circle of attention had quietly formed around gate B-17. Ryan broke the silence first. I asked for your identification. You did, Daniel replied evenly. And I asked whether I was being detained. Officer Mason Walker let out a short laugh. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I'm asking a simple question. Ryan stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. We received a report. What kind of report? That's not information you're entitled to. Daniel nodded once, neither agreeing nor arguing. I understand. The calmness in his voice seemed only to deepen Ryan's irritation. Most people became defensive. Some became angry. Others apologized for things they hadn't done. Daniel did none of those. His composure denied the officers the reaction they appeared to expect. Ryan glanced toward Daniel's carry-on. Open the bag. Is there probable cause? I don't need to explain myself. Daniel looked at the suitcase before returning his eyes to Ryan. I'd like to cooperate within the law. The sentence sounded respectful, yet it somehow shifted the balance of the conversation. Several nearby passengers exchanged uncertain looks. One middle-aged woman quietly whispered to her husband, "He doesn't seem dangerous." Another traveler continued recording from farther away, holding his phone chest-high instead of above his head. No one spoke loudly. The tension itself discouraged conversation. Ryan noticed the growing audience. His voice became firmer. Last warning. For what? Daniel asked. For failing to comply. Daniel's expression never changed. I haven't refused anything. That answer lingered. Even Mason briefly hesitated before looking toward his partner. Ryan reached for Daniel's carry-on handle. I'll inspect it myself. Daniel gently placed one hand on the suitcase. I wouldn't recommend touching my property without legal authority. Ryan immediately interpreted the gesture as resistance. There it is. His hand moved toward Daniel's wrist. Within seconds, nearby conversations stopped altogether. Rolling suitcases continued past the terminal, but people themselves slowed almost instinctively. The airport suddenly felt much smaller. Daniel neither stepped backward nor forward. He simply watched Ryan's movements with remarkable attention, as though memorizing every decision being made. You are escalating this, Ryan said. Daniel answered quietly. No, officer. You are. The words landed harder than either officer expected. Across the concourse, the same man in the gray suit looked up once more. This time he wasn't alone. A woman wearing an airport operations badge paused beside him, following his gaze toward the confrontation before speaking softly into a wireless earpiece. Neither approached. Neither interrupted. They simply watched, unseen by almost everyone else. Ryan tightened his grip on Daniel's wrist. Turn around. For what charge? You'll find out later. A murmur spread through the crowd. Even travelers who had arrived moments earlier could sense something felt wrong. Daniel slowly released his suitcase handle. He offered no resistance, no protest, only one final sentence. I hope every camera nearby is working today. Ryan smirked, believing he had finally regained control. He had no idea those words were not a warning. They were an observation. And somewhere beyond the terminal walls, people who had been waiting for this exact moment had just received confirmation that the line had finally been crossed. Officer Ryan Carter believed he had taken control the moment Daniel Brooks released his suitcase. He couldn't have been more mistaken. The crowd watched as Ryan guided Daniel a few steps away from the main walkway, one hand gripping his wrist, while Officer Mason Walker positioned himself beside them. Travelers slowed naturally, careful not to interfere, but unable to ignore what was unfolding in the middle of one of the busiest airports in the country. Daniel remained composed. His breathing stayed even. His eyes never wandered. Instead, they quietly measured everything around him. The security cameras mounted above the terminal, the nearest emergency call station, the growing number of witnesses, and the two officers standing directly in front of him. Ryan interpreted the silence as defeat. You should have just handed over your ID. Daniel answered calmly. I still intend to. Ryan frowned. But not before understanding why I'm being detained. Mason shook his head. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm asking for information. Same difference. Several feet away, the woman wearing the airport operations badge continued speaking softly into her earpiece. Beside her, the man in the gray suit never took his eyes off the encounter. Neither appeared alarmed. If anything, they seemed to be waiting. Ryan finally reached into Daniel's jacket pocket himself, removing a leather wallet. A ripple of discomfort spread through the nearby crowd. One passenger quietly muttered, "Can they do that?" Another simply kept recording. Ryan flipped open the wallet. Driver's license. Credit cards. Nothing unusual. His confidence faltered for only a fraction of a second before returning. "What's the purpose of your trip?" "A business meeting." "Where?" "Washington." "What business?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Professional." Ryan snapped the wallet shut. "You expect me to believe that?" Daniel offered no response. The officer's frustration became increasingly visible. He wasn't finding what he expected. No suspicious documents. No nervous behavior. No inconsistent answers. Only calm cooperation wrapped in quiet confidence. Behind them, another airport police unit approached but stopped several yards away after exchanging brief looks with the operations supervisor. Instead of intervening, they remained where they were, watching with noticeable caution. Daniel noticed them immediately. So did Ryan. "They're here to assist," Ryan said confidently. Daniel simply replied, "We'll see." For the first time, Ryan hesitated. Something about those two words unsettled him. Not because they sounded threatening, because they sounded certain. Across the terminal, passengers began whispering among themselves. "He hasn't argued once. Why are they still holding him? This doesn't look right." The atmosphere had changed. Only minutes earlier, most people assumed the officers were responding to a legitimate concern. Now uncertainty had replaced confidence. Ryan felt it. His authority no longer carried automatic agreement. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, subject remains uncooperative." Daniel slowly turned his head. "I've answered every question." Ryan ignored him. "We may need additional support." The response crackled through the speaker, too distorted for nearby travelers to understand. But someone else did. The man in the gray suit touched the small microphone hidden beneath his jacket. "Confirmed," he said quietly. "Maintain observation." No one in the crowd heard him. No one except the woman beside him, who gave a nearly invisible nod before looking back toward Daniel. Ryan believed reinforcements were coming for him. He had no idea that every passing minute, every unnecessary decision, and every word spoken into his radio was becoming part of a much larger record, one that had begun long before Daniel Brooks ever walked into the airport terminal. Every abuse of authority reaches a moment when confidence quietly becomes evidence. Officer Ryan Carter didn't realize he had already crossed that line. He unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his duty belt while keeping his eyes fixed on Daniel Brooks. The metallic click echoed through the terminal with surprising clarity, drawing even more attention from passing travelers. Mason Walker stepped closer. "Turn around." Daniel looked from one officer to the other. "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Then am I free to leave?" Ryan answered immediately. "No." Daniel gave a slow nod, as though he had just received confirmation of something he already suspected. "I understand." Without another word, he calmly turned around. Several people in the crowd exchanged confused glances. One woman whispered, "If he's not under arrest, why are they cuffing him?" No one answered. Ryan secured one cuff around Daniel's wrist. The second followed a moment later. The sound of steel locking into place seemed far louder than it actually was. Daniel never resisted. He never pulled away. Instead, he slowly looked upward. Above them, another security camera silently observed the entire encounter. His eyes lingered there for only a second before returning forward. Ryan noticed. "What are you looking at?" Daniel answered softly. "Nothing that won't still be there tomorrow." The response irritated Ryan more than open defiance would have. He tightened his grip on Daniel's arm. "You think you're smarter than everyone here?" Daniel remained silent. Sometimes silence forces people to fill it themselves. Ryan did exactly that. "I've dealt with people like you before." The sentence hung awkwardly in the air. Several passengers looked at one another. It wasn't simply what he had said. It was how he had said it. The assumptions behind the words required no explanation. Across the concourse, the airport operations supervisor quietly stepped away from the observation point. She spoke briefly into her radio. "Copy." Then she disappeared through a restricted access door. The man in the gray suit remained exactly where he was. Watching, waiting, measuring. Mason lowered his voice. "Ryan, what? Maybe we should verify with dispatch again." Ryan shook his head. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Daniel heard every word. He spoke without turning around. "Confidence is valuable." Ryan smirked. "It is." So is verification. The officer ignored him. Instead, he guided Daniel toward a nearby seating area, clearly intending to isolate him from the growing audience. But the audience followed anyway. Not physically, with their eyes, with their phones, with quiet questions that spread from traveler to traveler. By now, fewer people believed they were watching a dangerous suspect. More believed they were watching an unnecessary confrontation. Near the entrance to the concourse, two individuals wearing dark business attire emerged from opposite directions. Neither displayed a badge. Neither wore a uniform. To everyone else, they appeared to be ordinary airport employees. The man in the gray suit acknowledged them with the smallest nod. Positions changed. Sightlines overlapped. The circle around the incident quietly expanded. Ryan noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed entirely on Daniel. He believed he was controlling one passenger. He never imagined he had become the center of someone else's operation. And as another elevator door opened at the far end of the terminal, the first people capable of changing everything had finally arrived, without a single person in the crowd realizing who they really were. The terminal had become unusually quiet, not because people had stopped moving, but because everyone sensed they were witnessing something that no longer felt routine. Daniel Brooks stood in handcuffs without lowering his head. Officer Ryan Carter saw compliance. The witnesses saw composure. Those were not the same thing. Ryan looked around the growing crowd with visible satisfaction. "Everyone can move along," he announced. "This situation is under control." Almost no one moved. Instead, more phones appeared. Travelers who had been hurrying toward connecting flights slowed their pace, curiosity overcoming schedules. Even nearby airline employees had begun watching discreetly from behind service counters. The story unfolding before them no longer matched the confidence in Ryan's voice. Daniel quietly broke the silence. "Officer Carter." Ryan glanced at him. "What?" "I'd like to know whether my rights have been documented in your report." Ryan laughed under his breath. "We're not writing reports yet." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I see." Mason shifted uneasily beside his partner. "We've got enough people watching." Ryan dismissed the concern. "Let them watch." Across the terminal, the man in the gray suit finally stepped away from the wall where he had been standing for nearly 15 minutes. He wasn't rushing. Neither were the two professionally dressed individuals who had appeared moments earlier. Without drawing attention to themselves, the three quietly positioned themselves at different angles around the concourse. Their movements looked accidental. They weren't. Daniel noticed every one of them. His expression remained unchanged. At nearly the same moment, the airport operations supervisor returned through the restricted access door. This time she wasn't alone. Two senior airport administrators accompanied her, speaking softly while observing the confrontation from a distance. Neither approached Ryan. Neither interrupted. They simply watched. One administrator quietly checked the time. The other looked toward the security cameras overhead before making a brief note on a tablet. Ryan remained completely unaware. He focused only on Daniel. "You've been very calm." Daniel answered with quiet honesty. Remaining calm usually helps people see things more clearly. Ryan smirked. "You're about to have plenty of time to think." Daniel looked directly at him. "That depends on whose timetable we're following." The sentence lingered. Mason frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, his attention shifted beyond the officers. At the far end of the terminal, elevator doors opened once again. Three individuals stepped out wearing conservative business suits, each carrying nothing more noticeable than a small leather portfolio. No uniforms, no visible badges, nothing that attracted attention. Yet the man in the gray suit subtly straightened the moment he saw them. The airport operations supervisor stopped speaking. Even the administrators turned slightly in their direction. It was almost imperceptible, but Daniel noticed. Ryan didn't. He continued speaking into his shoulder radio, requesting updates that never seemed to arrive as quickly as he expected. A faint vibration came from the radio instead. A short acknowledgement. No details. No reassurance. Only instructions to remain where he was. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Ryan's face. Only for an instant. Then it disappeared behind the confidence he had worn since the encounter began. He still believed additional support was coming to validate his decisions. He never considered another possibility. That every person quietly arriving in the terminal had not come to assist him. They had come because someone else had finally reached the exact moment they had been waiting for. Power often announces itself with a raised voice. Real authority usually arrives without one. The three men in business suits crossed the terminal at an unhurried pace. They carried no visible credentials. No one stepped aside for them. No one recognized them. To the travelers watching the confrontation, they were simply more passengers moving through another busy airport morning. Only Daniel Brooks acknowledged their arrival. Not with a smile. Not with relief. Only with the slightest change in his eyes. Officer Ryan Carter remained focused on his prisoner. "You've been awfully patient," he said. Daniel answered quietly. "Patience and time are usually on the same side." Ryan scoffed. "We'll see." "We will." Before Ryan could say another word, one of the suited men stopped several feet away. He didn't interrupt. He simply observed. The second positioned himself near the entrance to the concourse. The third quietly spoke with the airport operations supervisor, who immediately handed him a tablet containing incident information. Ryan finally noticed them. He frowned. "Can I help you?" The first man smiled politely. "Please continue." Ryan looked confused. "This is an active police matter." "I understand." The answer came with complete confidence. Nothing more. No challenge. No explanation. Something about the exchange unsettled Mason Walker. He leaned closer to Ryan. "Do you know who they are?" Ryan shook his head. "No." Daniel remained silent. The first suited man looked briefly toward Daniel before addressing Ryan again. "Officer, could you summarize the reason for the detention?" Ryan answered without hesitation. "We received a report concerning suspicious behavior." "What behavior?" Ryan paused. He matched the description. "What description?" For the first time since the encounter began, Ryan struggled to answer immediately. "We're still verifying." The suited man nodded once. "I see." He entered a brief note into a small digital device. No emotion. No judgment. Only documentation. Nearby, more passengers noticed the conversation. Whispers spread quickly. "They're asking questions now. Who are those people? Why is the officer explaining himself?" The atmosphere shifted once again. Only minutes earlier, everyone had been watching Daniel. Now many were watching Ryan. The balance of attention had quietly reversed. Mason cleared his throat. "Sir, may I ask which department you're with?" The suited man reached calmly into his jacket. Ryan expected a badge. Instead, he removed a simple identification wallet and held it where only the officers could see it. Both Ryan and Mason stared. Neither spoke. Whatever they had read erased the confidence from their faces. Ryan instinctively released his grip on Daniel's arm. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Daniel finally looked directly at Ryan. "I told you earlier," he said in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. "Verification matters." The suited man closed the identification wallet. "We're going to review everything that has occurred here." His tone remained professional. No anger. No threats. Only certainty. Behind him, additional personnel quietly entered the concourse, not rushing, not drawing attention, but positioning themselves with practiced precision. The witnesses sensed the change before they understood it. Whatever authority Officer Carter believed he possessed a few minutes earlier was no longer the highest authority in the terminal. And for the first time that morning, Ryan Carter realized he was no longer the one asking the questions. The difference between confidence and certainty became visible the moment Officer Ryan Carter's hands began to tremble. It lasted less than a second, but Daniel Brooks noticed. So did the man with the identification wallet. The suited official looked at Ryan with measured professionalism. "Officer Carter," he said calmly, "I'd like you to remove the handcuffs." Ryan hesitated. "Sir, with respect, I have legal authority to—" "You had authority to begin an investigative stop." The official's voice never rose. "Whether you had authority to continue this detention is precisely what we are now reviewing." Silence settled over the terminal. Even the rolling suitcases seemed quieter. Ryan glanced toward Mason Walker. His partner avoided eye contact. The certainty that had carried them through the encounter was fading with every passing second. Daniel remained motionless. He didn't interrupt. He didn't demand an apology. He simply waited. The official turned toward another member of his team. "Have we secured the surveillance feeds?" "Every camera covering this concourse," came the reply. "Audio. Body cameras have already been requested." Ryan's expression changed. Until that moment, he had been thinking about the present. Now he was thinking about everything that had already happened. Every command. Every assumption. Every unnecessary decision. Nearby passengers exchanged knowing glances. The phones that had recorded Daniel were now pointed almost entirely at the officers. Without anyone saying it aloud, the story had reversed. Daniel was no longer the center of suspicion. Ryan was becoming the center of scrutiny. The official stepped closer. "Officer, before we continue, I have one more question." Ryan swallowed. "Yes, sir. What objective facts led you to conclude this individual presented a threat requiring restraint?" Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came. He looked toward Mason. His partner remained silent. Finally, Ryan answered. "He matched a description." "What description?" Ryan hesitated again. "We're still confirming that." The official nodded slowly. "So at the moment you applied restraints, the description had not yet been verified." Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence answered for him. Daniel finally spoke. "May I ask something?" The official turned immediately. "Of course, Mr. Brooks." It was the first time anyone had addressed Daniel by name. Several people in the crowd noticed. Ryan certainly did. Daniel looked toward the official. "Before these officers make any further statements, I'd appreciate it if every recording remained preserved." The official gave a small nod. "Already done." Another member of the team stepped forward. "Body camera uploads have been locked." A second added. "Airport surveillance has been preserved." A third quietly confirmed. "Witness recordings are being identified." The operation unfolded with remarkable efficiency. No shouting. No dramatic gestures. Only calm professionals following established procedures. Ryan watched it happen in disbelief. He suddenly realized none of these people had rushed into the terminal to defend Daniel. They had come to protect the integrity of whatever truth the evidence revealed. That realization unsettled him even more. The official looked back at Daniel. "Mr. Brooks, I apologize for the delay." Daniel answered with the same calm dignity he had shown from the beginning. "I'm more interested in accuracy than speed." The official smiled faintly. "So are we." Around them, the terminal slowly returned to motion. Flights continued boarding. Announcements echoed overhead. Life resumed. Yet for Officer Ryan Carter, time seemed to stand completely still. Because he had finally understood something Daniel Brooks had known from the very beginning. The cameras had never been Daniel's greatest protection. The truth had. The handcuffs came off with a soft metallic click. No applause followed. No dramatic celebration. Only a silence so complete that it forced everyone present to confront what had just happened. Daniel Brooks slowly rubbed his wrist where the steel had rested moments before. There was no anger in his expression, only composure. The suited official stepped slightly aside. "Mr. Brooks, you're free to continue your travel whenever you're ready." Daniel inclined his head politely. "Thank you." He made no move to leave. Instead, he remained where he was, looking calmly at the two officers who had stopped him less than half an hour earlier. Ryan Carter couldn't bring himself to meet Daniel's eyes. The confidence that had filled his voice at Gate B-17 had disappeared completely. His radio remained silent. His explanations had run out. The official addressed another member of his team. "Separate the officers." Within seconds, Ryan and Mason were politely escorted several feet apart. No one touched them aggressively. No one raised a voice. The procedure itself carried enough weight. An investigator approached Mason first. "I'll need an independent account of the encounter." Another investigator stood before Ryan. "We'll begin with the initial reason for the stop." Ryan nodded weakly. Around them, airport personnel resumed their duties, but the witnesses remained. Many were still recording. Others simply watched quietly, unwilling to leave before understanding how the story would end. The airport operations supervisor walked toward Daniel. "Sir, would you be willing to preserve your statement before boarding?" "Of course." She thanked him. Her tone reflected respect rather than obligation. Nearby, one of the investigators reviewed timestamps from the airport surveillance system. Initial contact. He tapped the screen. Request for identification. Another tap. Physical seizure of luggage. Another. Application of restraints. Each event appeared in precise chronological order. Facts, not opinions. The suited official looked toward Ryan. "Officer Carter, evidence has a remarkable habit." Ryan swallowed. "Sir, it remembers what people forget." Those words settled heavily over the terminal. Daniel quietly collected his suitcase. He carefully straightened the handle before placing one hand on it. Nothing about his movements suggested triumph. That caught several witnesses by surprise. One elderly traveler finally stepped forward. "I've been watching since the beginning." Daniel turned politely. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Daniel offered a faint smile. "Thank you." The man nodded once before walking away. No speech. No spectacle. Just simple human dignity. Mason finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it would go this far." Daniel looked at him. Most people don't. There was no bitterness in the answer. Only truth. The investigator finished reviewing another section of footage. He looked toward the official. "The recordings are consistent. So are the witness accounts." The official closed his notebook. "Good." He then faced Daniel once more. "Your cooperation made this review significantly easier." Daniel answered softly. "The truth usually does." A boarding announcement echoed through the concourse. Passengers slowly gathered their belongings. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Flights would depart. Stores would reopen. The terminal would soon look exactly as it had before. But for everyone who had witnessed the encounter, something invisible had changed. They had arrived believing authority always belonged to the loudest voice. They were leaving having learned that genuine authority belongs to the facts, and that dignity, when protected by truth, can quietly outlast every abuse of power. Several hours later, Gate B-17 looked exactly as it had before. Passengers hurried toward departures. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors. Boarding announcements blended into the familiar rhythm of the airport. To everyone passing through, it was simply another ordinary afternoon. Only those who had witnessed the encounter understood that something extraordinary had happened there. Daniel Brooks returned briefly before his rescheduled flight. Not because he had forgotten anything. Because someone had asked if he would answer one final question. The suited official met him near a quiet conference room overlooking the concourse. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "thank you for your patience today." Daniel offered the same calm smile he had carried throughout the entire ordeal. "I appreciate professionalism." The official nodded. "So do we." He handed Daniel a small document confirming that all available evidence had been preserved and that the incident would receive a formal administrative review. Daniel accepted it without reading immediately. He trusted the process more than the paper. Outside the glass wall, life continued uninterrupted. Inside, the conversation remained remarkably simple. "I'm sorry you experienced this," the official said. Daniel looked through the window for a long moment before answering. "I've learned something over the years." The official waited. Character isn't revealed when people are respected. He paused. It's revealed when they believe no one important is watching. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The silence carried more weight than another speech ever could. Elsewhere in the terminal, Officer Ryan Carter quietly surrendered his body camera for evidence processing. Administrative investigators escorted him through procedures he had once supervised for others. No handcuffs. No humiliation. Only accountability. Mason Walker completed his own statement in a separate room. Both officers understood that the investigation would now rely on facts rather than assumptions. Exactly as it should. Before leaving, Daniel walked once more through the concourse where everything had begun. Several airport employees recognized him. One nodded respectfully. Another simply smiled. No words were necessary. Sometimes dignity is acknowledged without conversation. As Daniel approached the security checkpoint leading toward his new departure gate, he paused beneath one of the surveillance cameras. He looked up briefly, then continued walking. Not because the camera had protected him, but because the truth it recorded had protected everyone who still believed fairness mattered. Behind him, the airport slowly erased every visible sign that an incident had occurred. The crowd dispersed. The investigators departed. The hallway returned to normal. Only the lesson remained. Power can command attention. Fear can demand silence. Prejudice can shape first impressions. But none of them can permanently outrun the truth. Because truth asks for no applause. It requires no raised voice. It simply waits, patiently, until every assumption is measured against every fact. And when that moment finally arrives, justice rarely announces itself with anger. It arrives quietly. It removes the handcuffs. It preserves the evidence. It restores dignity. Then it walks away without needing to prove anything at all. Because on that ordinary day inside an airport terminal, one officer believed a badge gave him the final word. He was wrong. The final word belonged to the truth. And the truth never needed to raise its voice.